So the Dead Cells 1.9 Update Aplenty release occurred a couple days ago. It's a fairly controversial one within the community, and I have had my criticisms throughout the process. But now that it's officially out and a lot of the things have been ironed out, such as the bugs and such as some of the things that the community has taken issue with, I wanted to talk a little about my final thoughts on this update. I'm going to highlight some of the positives, the negatives, and what I would personally like to see in the future. Before we get started, if you aren't subscribed, I like to do Dead Cells guides, runs, commentaries, and outside of Dead Cells, I do social commentaries with a huge focus on mental health, and occasionally other games. If any of that interests you, feel free to hit the subscribe button, turn on the bell for future notifications, and let's do this. I feel like in order to talk about this update and my overall thoughts on it, we need to talk about some of the significant changes that occurred throughout this process. And first off was the biggest one, which was the economy. And there's a lot of different branches from this particular topic, but I'll try to address everything one by one. One of the devs came out before the update, at least the alpha update, and said that the feedback towards the game economy for the last several updates presented a difficult scenario for those who didn't have the Forge maxed out. For those who don't know, the Forge is what takes place after beating either the first or second boss, where you can pour cells into getting either plus, or S tier weapons. The amount in which you can pour into one of these tiers depends on what BC you're on. For example, 2 BC you can update your entire plus but not all of S tier, whereas on 4 BC you can update your entire S tier. And before 1.9, this meant getting either 1 scroll in your weapon, which was double plus tier, or 2 scrolls, S tier. For example, let's take something like the Torch, which was a pure brutality item. If it was a plus tier item, then it would have 1 scroll in red. If it was an S tier item, it would have 2 scrolls in red. Let's take something else such as the Hakuto's bow, which is part brutality, part tactics. If it was plus tier, then it would have either a brutality or a tactic scroll. If it was S tier, it would have one of 3 things. Either 2 brutality, 2 tactics, or 1 brutality, 1 tactics. So it really just depended on what you got, what tier you were on, that sort of thing. But in addition to these weapon scrolls, it also allowed for better chances at affixes, which allowed for better synergy and generally more powerful items, because DPS was also affected by these tiers. And so what would end up happening is that they would end up getting extremely expensive, and it would make it hard to pick up other items. And when you didn't have the Forge max out, you'd have to upgrade them at the affix reroll shop. And so the economy was changed to reflect this. Items became cheaper, rerolls were cheaper, flasks became cheaper, upgrades were cheaper, basically everything became cheaper. The caveat was that you didn't end up earning as much money, and I think this was fairly controversial for people for a variety of reasons, but I personally love what they did to the economy. For example, if I was running a brutality build in 1.8 and had S tier weapons maxed out, I would have kept a level 7 weapon with double red scrolls, then a level 10 weapon with 1 red and 1 green, since 1 scroll makes a fairly significant difference in power. And I should know right now, I'll be kind of interchanging brutality in red, tactics in purple, survival in green, so just keep in mind that I'm going to do that throughout. But anyways, if there was something that I really wanted, I would have had to keep re-rolling over and over again, and so I wouldn't have had the opportunity to pick up better items. So this change, it reflected placing more importance on weapon levels and affixes instead of what scrolls they offered, which I think should have always been the case. And this is where removing scrolls on weapons presented a significant and important change. When you have plus or S tier items, as I said earlier, your weapons will have stats on them, or would have had stats on them. When you have 100% S tier items, that is 8 crucial additional scrolls that you're going to need with your 2 weapons and 2 skills. If you weren't able to have good RNG that run, you are potentially down several stats, which could have easily been the difference between a win or a loss, between power and no power essentially. And 1.9 fixed that in removing it entirely. And to compensate for these scrolls that were removed, because keep in mind we are now down 8 scrolls, they scattered different scrolls throughout the level. Promenade and Arboretum, for example, have more colorless scrolls attached to them. Promenade and Arboretum, for example, have 2 colorless scrolls and 2 dual stat scrolls. And it greatly reduced the RNG that came with these weapon scrolls. And yes, there's always going to be RNG in Dead Cells, that's just the nature of the beast, given that it's such a diverse game with so many different opportunities at different types of builds within the same run. However, by taking out an entirely luck-based mechanic, you have made the game more about skill than what items happen to drop and what scrolls they were. You can run builds you want to. If an item has 2 stats, such as Assassin's Dagger, instead of being worried that an item has 2 purple when you're running Brutality, or Red, or whatever you want to call it. I remember so many times between 1.0 and 1.8 when I wouldn't take an item even if it was really good because it had 2 stats in the wrong stat. And I wasn't going to be able to use it because then I wouldn't have enough power. I would lose power, actually. So again, I wouldn't take a level 10 or a level 12 weapon if it didn't have the right scrolls attached to them. So that all is out the window now, and I can feel free to grab that level 10 or level 12 item if it presents an opportunity for me to make my build even stronger. And that has allowed me to be able to build in a much more efficient manner. And speaking of picking up items, the shops, in addition to the price change, saw another significant change. So the shops used to have something called a merchandise category. So that would be if you're trying to get a weapon or a shield, for example, it was divided into melee, ranged, and shields. And for skills, it would have been traps and turrets, grenades, and powers. Well, they called it miscellaneous skills. And there was always an option for random. And now what they do is that they have either brutality, tactics, or survival. Red, purple, or green. And this was interesting because it presented both good and bad things, and I think it really depends on the type of player for their preference. Me personally, I like the old shop a lot better, but that's primarily because I run specific builds on custom mode for my channel. And since I don't have everything unlocked, it made stat-based shops very RNG-based as opposed to the old shops when I could scope out what specific thing that I needed to make my build much more efficient. And upon hearing this feedback, the devs actually did add back the old shops, and now it's a custom mode option that does not affect achievements. So if you want, you can either go with the old merchandise category, or you can go with the color-based shops, and I think that's a really, really good thing. It's the perfect compromise, as people who run more normal mode stuff will prefer the stat-based shops due to not having a specific build, and people like me who do will use custom mode and will prefer the merchandise category. And you got people from all over the place that will do normal mode but like the merchandise category, people who run custom mode but like the color shops. I think any way you put it, it's a really good compromise. Rerolls also became free and are done 5 times before stopping, which allowed you to choose from an item pool of 15 items as opposed to 9 from before, and the rerolls before you had to pay for. So now you basically get 5 free rolls and you get to choose between 15 items. No matter what type of shop you prefer, it was a great change, allowing you to either strengthen your build or freely change it up. And with the reroll change and the price changes, shops now easily allow you to pick up multiple items to let you go into a new direction, which is awesome. It allows you to really go from a build that's kind of meh to having another build that is awesome. Now, the first go around in the alpha was, needless to say, a bit rough. Enemies did way too much damage early game, and you'd have like 5 total stats in the beginning of Promenade, or whatever second level you chose. So something like runners would do about 50% damage even on a survival build. Late game, enemy damage was irrelevant as you had the necessary scrolls by then, but a lot of health. So it was pretty unbalanced. Through patch after patch, the devs were able to make it so that early game damage wasn't crippling, and late game damage, while not outwardly deadly, would become less of a joke. Not too many bosses saw a change outside of Giant, who went through the gauntlet in terms of changes. There was a bug in the beginning of the patch that lasted for quite a while, where the hands would lose a ton of health very, very quickly, but this was eventually fixed. Now, the significant change is that killing one of the hands merely reduces its charge by 1 instead of completely depleting the charges. So what this means is that occasionally during the Giant battle, you'll see a hand kind of shake its fist, and that means it's charging. And when it hits 4 charges, it does the special attack, depending on the hand. If it's the right hand, it does a flame wave spam. I don't know how to describe it, but basically when the hand smacks down, a bunch of fire waves spread out, and that's what this does, except it just spams it. It's very equivalent to the skeleton in the cavern, that same attack. And if it's the left hand, it's just your standard kind of bullet hell. So previously, if you had a hand at 2 charges, it would have been 0, but now it's at 1. Makes the fight a little more intense, which is pretty cool. Weapon skills and mutations saw some pretty significant changes, and I'll try and address everything that I can. Multiple knocks, marksman's bow, nerves of steel, and electric whips were designated from a dual stat weapon to pure tactics. I personally didn't really care about these changes, as the latter 3 weapons I only ever used on tactics, but I also know I'm not the only player in the world. So many people were not happy with these changes, especially the electric whip. With weapon scrolls no longer being a thing, I think changing the weapon designation feels a little bit pointless. Like, I don't really see the difference in making electric whip tactics versus keeping it as brutality tactics, especially without weapon scrolls. It feels like it would be a lot more diverse. I don't know. Let me know what you guys think. Slight improvements were also made to the multiple knocks, marksman's bow, and nerves of steel, amongst many other weapons such as torch, Spartan sandals, and just, oh my god, so many things were improved. But for those particular 3 weapons, you can think about ammo count, fire rate, or power. You can view the improvement of these 3 weapons in one of these 3 categories. For example, Nerves of Steel got better ammo, Multiple Knocks got more power and better fire rate, so things like that. And speaking of Multiple Knocks, it went from a fairly forgettable starting weapon, in my opinion, to a force to be reckoned with. War Javelin didn't have a power change, but now when you tap the button, when you throw the javelin, you actually will teleport towards it. That means you have an added defensive and offensive utility, which I hope to get to in a future guide. You can escape mobs, enemy attacks, or even put yourself in a position to get a powerful hit off. Wings of Crows saw some of the best changes I've ever seen to a skill. Instead of simply hovering above enemies for a certain amount of time and then having to wait 24 seconds, the cooldown was reduced to at first 5 seconds and later 15. It now applies shock damage, which we'll talk about a little bit later on, and it allows for upward and downward movement. Stomping with it while the skill is active now does a lot of spread damage to nearby enemies, and you can jump up back into the wings if it's still active, or press the button again to cancel it. Mutations that deal with bonus DPS became percentage based instead of having a scroll dependent fixed DPS count. And these were Combo, Gastronomy, Vengeance, Tainted Flask, Support, Tranquility, and Extended Healing. Necromancy, as is tradition, saw a debuff to it and now only heals to 50%, as opposed to healing up to 100% before, making it kinda fairly useless. There are many more changes, and you can look at the patch notes to see everything. All of the ones I listed above I think are the most notable. And now you may be wondering, what about the two-handed weapons? What are your thoughts on those? What about damage over time? You need to get a haircut. And yes, I will talk about all of these. The haircut thing is the haircut thing. We're in quarantine. I can't exactly go out and get one. But we will talk about the two-handed weapons first and then talk about the damage over time things. I think they deserve their own sections, which is why I put them separate from everything else. Two-handed weapons were a mixed bag. All crossbows, with the exception of Sonic Crossbow, which was renamed the Sonic Carbine, were designated as two-handed weapons and put as pure survival. These are the following: Heavy, Repeater, Ice, and Explosive. Heavy turned into a straight-up shotgun, with the main hand having the typical attack and secondary hand reloading for crits on the main hand. Ice's main hand froze enemies, as usual, while the secondary was a piercing all-shot that critted frozen enemies. Explosive Crossbow, as is tradition, the main hand was the traditional attack, while the secondary hand became a melee attack similar to Rhythm and Bazooki's attacking pattern. First hit was a down smash, second hit was a critical hit that swung upwards. Repeater Crossbow saw some similar changes, with the main hand being the traditional attack, and the secondary hand becoming a rain of rooting arrows, and the main hand would fire and end up doing critical hits onto those rooted enemies. So it ended up synergizing off of each other, which was pretty cool. So in terms of two-handed weapons, the stuff that I feel improved the most were the Repeater and the Explosive Crossbow. Repeater Crossbow was never bad, but I think it definitely did suffer from an inconsistent power. Now with having a secondary hand that roots enemies, it becomes a beast in biomes. Explosive Crossbow, as some of you may know, was what I considered to be the worst weapon in the game. And now that's 100% opinion, and I'm aware people liked it in previous incarnations, but I found it to be slow and weak. The melee attack I found to be the crux of what makes it good now, as it pairs with Heart of Ice extremely well for bosses, while the ranged attack is good for biomes. Ice and Heavy, unfortunately, I felt became significantly worse. What made Heavy Crossbow so good was the fact that you could run it with the shield. So since the firing is fairly slow, you could parry out of a miscalculated fire, but now you don't necessarily get that luxury. Plus, consider that boss damage caps exist in Dead Cells, meaning that you can only do a finite amount of damage against them. Heavy crossbow is what I consider to be the biggest victim of this, as it is slow and not able to get many hits off in a row, crit or not. Ice crossbow's issue is that while the freeze range improved, it does not pierce enemies anymore unless it is legendary or ran an extremely rare affix, which was not the case before. Two-handed weapons in theory are a good idea, but I think the issue comes with the fact that they are all survival. And I think this is the wrong stat to try this in. Here's the thing. Survival is the shield stat. All shields are survival, like all melee attacks with the exception of the sights or brutality, which honestly I kind of disagree with. And all ranged weapons are tactics. So if anything, all these weapons should have been tactics instead. Because now what the issue is that many great survival mutations such as Blind Faith or Spite are now irrelevant, and coming up with cooldown mutations for these weapons is a chore, or mutations in general is a chore, with the exception of Explosive Crossbow with the Heart of Ice mutation or Repeater Crossbow with Instinct of the Master of Arms. I'll get into my ideas for two-handed weapons a little bit later, and other improvements as well. I think the concept of two-handed weapons is a really cool concept, and has a lot of potential as we saw with the sights and repeater crossbow, but it needs to be fleshed out more before releasing future updates. Brutality and tactics no doubt deserve two-handed weapons, and you can either come up with new ones or update existing ones, but them being all survivals severely impacts their usefulness. For me, a two-handed weapon needs to be powerful and completely bodied biomes and bosses because you don't have the luxury of running a shield or another secondary weapon. Sights and repeater crossbow do this, even if you have to strategize a little bit more than simply parrying attacks. Explosive crossbow somewhat does this, but the power kind of leaves a little bit to be desired. Heavy and ice unfortunately do not do this because of the fact that boss damage caps exist among other shortcomings, and so that makes them not really worth the take, especially at the risk of losing a shield. One thing to note is if that you're using one of the items, you can now store a backpack item, which means that if you have something sitting in your back pocket, if you want to change builds later on and not use a two-handed weapon, you can pick up a shield or a different weapon later on, and you're free to do so without spending too much money at once at shops, which is a really good change. Damage over time, or DOT for short, saw a significant rework as well, and I'll list them off below. Bleed now stacks and does an explosive damage when reached to a certain amount of bleed stacks. Poison now spreads to nearby enemies, making Alchemic Carbine one of, if not the most, deadly dot weapon in the game. Burn was mostly unchanged, as was Burning Oil. Freeze's diminishing effects against bosses saw a rework. Instead of freeze becoming irrelevant the later you went on in a boss battle, it now only loses its effect for a few seconds on a cooldown. Giant's immunity to freeze was unaffected by this. The new shock status was introduced, which was given to the following: Electric Whip, Thunder Shield, Lightning Bolt, Magnetic Grenade, Wings of the Crow, and any skill with the electrocutes enemy affix. I did a whole over-explained run on electricity, you can watch that, I will leave a card for you guys. Status damage affixes were also changed with the exception of Bleed, which is still at 60%, Frozen at 175, and Burning Oil at 100. Poison was reduced to 80% from 100, Burn increased from 30 to 40, and Shock was added at 40%, Rooted at 75%, Slowdown at 30, and Stunned I believe at 70%. The changes to DOT have given each status a unique identity, rather than, well, a simple damage over time. In my opinion, Poison and Electrocution are the two best status inflictions in the game. Poison spread is pretty ridiculous, honestly. It can easily clear off mobs, especially those with smaller enemies, while Shock is inflicted pretty quickly due to the nature of the weapons it's on. So Electric Whip went from being really good to one of the best weapons in the entire game. Other slight changes include enemy attacking patterns such as Guardians, which were renamed to other Knights, and Duelists. Scroll fragment changes were had in Sanctuary and Timekeeper, which are now 4 and 3 respectively on 4 to 5 BC, as well as various bug fixes. Corrosive Cloud gained the electrocution status and lost some of the more useless affixes that it previously had, and certain cooldowns were either nerfed or buffed. Obviously I didn't cover every single change, but again, I don't think that this is the point of the video. This is more into the overlook of changes that I felt were significant and my personal thoughts on them given many hours of 5BC gameplay. Now I would love to hear the opinions of those who are between 1 to 3 BC, because I have not had a chance to check out how the changes apply there, particularly for those who don't have the maxed out Forge. Before I get into my final thoughts on 1.9 and my overall grade, I want to throw out some suggestions for future things I would like to see in 1.10 or 2.0 or whatever direction they go in. First off is new bosses and biomes. I think Dead Cells is a great game, but I'd like to see more branching opportunities within this game, especially as it relates to biomes. I'd also like to see a pipeline from Corrupted Prison to Morass of the Banished. When you initially fight or defeat an elite, there's a significant slowdown that tends to mess up the timing of the player. When you're dealing with a mob or different elite abilities, this presents a huge challenge and can end a kill streak or even get you killed on a curse. I think this entire slowdown thing is unnecessary and a bit unfair, akin to the 1.0 to 1.2 elite bump, and I'd like to see this taken out. Two-handed weapons should be spread out on stats. I'd love to see more brutality and tactics options. For example, I really think the heavy crossbow or repeater crossbow should be tactics, while explosive could be brutality. Weapons such as twin daggers or crowbar could be two-handed weapons as well. Twin daggers, it's a two-handed weapon, theoretically, it's got two daggers, right? And a crowbar could have something like the door as a secondary weapon. I like to at some point come up with the crafting of various two-handed weapons for a different video. Cooldown options for two-handed weapons and more cooldown options for bosses, besides Instinct of the Master of Arms and Blind Faith, are desperately needed. I already went over this. But in general, I would like to see more cooldown options for different types of builds. For example, damage over time on Brutality does not have any cooldown options. Melee Tactics does not have any cooldown options outside of Instinct of the Master of Arms. So I would like to see different cooldown options within certain playstyles, instead of just by the stat itself. Items late game need to be way more expensive. I have consistently been able to get 4 level 12 items on 5DC and Caverns, and all I have to do is save up for about 2 biomes. It's a little bit too much and kind of makes the end of the game a little bit irrelevant. Enemies' late game damage was increased, but I think it should be slightly more. One of the things that I noticed is that if you have enough health, enemy damage is fairly inconsequential, especially on survival. Outside of the malaise issue, the end of the game becomes a little bit too easy in my opinion. So now that 1.9 is released and we've gone over some of the pros and cons in my opinion, where would I put it compared to all the other updates? And it's been tough assessing it, as I've been extremely involved in the process since the first alpha hit. From my first look video to my Nutcracker build a couple nights ago, I've had various opinions throughout the process. But at the end of the day, I have to say that I really enjoy 1.9. In fact, I'd wager some of the changes that were made are some of the best things the devs have ever done to this game. The weapon changes, the economy rework, removal of weapon scrolls, shot flexibility, and build flexibility have made the game a much more enjoyable experience for me. Two-handed weapons are a work in progress and I feel it needs more work, but I think what they put out was a good start. And something I didn't mention earlier about my whole weapon scroll thing is that now you have an opportunity to run certain off-color things such as shields or different skills that you may like, such as Wave of Denial. So I think that's also something to note. I think that if they had gotten everything absolutely perfect with the two-handed weapons, I would have definitely gone on record to say that this is the best Dead Cells update ever by far. Instead, I would rank it slightly below 1.4, which I maintain is honestly the pinnacle of Dead Cells. And maybe I should do a video at some point on what made 1.4 so fantastic, but it's always going to have a special place in my heart, especially since that was the first update we were on when I started producing content for this channel. 1.9's changes were controversial, but I'm on the side that they were for the better. The game feels so much more fluid now with far less RNG. It's an enjoyable experience for me and doesn't feel like a chore anymore, even if I still will never like certain playstyles or weapons. If I were to give it a grade on an F to A scale, I would give it a solid A. Thank you all so much for joining me. I really appreciate you taking time out of your day to watch my content. Again, if you aren't subscribed and want to see more Dead Cells content, be sure to hit the subscribe button and turn on the bell for future notifications. And I wanted to end on this. In these trying times, there's so much going on in the world, and I think it's so important to look out for each other and our own mental health. Most of my subscribers know that this is first and foremost a mental health advocacy focused channel, and I always encourage discussion on it and ending that stigma. Moreover, I think we need to end that stigma and be open about it and be able to have healthy, empathetic, and supportive discussion. Dead Cells is a great coping mechanism, at least it is for me, but I encourage you all to seek other ways you can take care of yourselves. Music, hobby, family, friends, whatever has meaning to you in your life, use that as much as you can. I always keep my social media links in the comments, and I'm available on all of them if you need anyone to reach out to. From this video onwards, I will be linking resources to various hotlines in the description. If you need to utilize them, they will be right there for you. Thank you all again. I love y'all, and I'm out.